Now we're going to look at some of the ways that you can break down the broader images in these poems and the metaphors that they're using into sort of little constituent elements, and say that it's not just, as simple as saying, thing X equals Y. There's different sort of episodic moments as we go through. As we look at follower, this image is broken down and we're shown different parts of it, all of which reflect different aspects of the relationship between the son and the father. For example, on line 4, the horse strained at his clicking tongue. Now this is referring, I'm sure that you've got a grasp on this already. I certainly don't have the expertise to understand this fully, but this is part of it that I think we'll come on to later. But this is to do with the way that you perform this task and the way that you control these animals. So there's this horse straining his clicking tongue. This is a horse which is dragging a plough along. It's an old-fashioned implement, so he's not riding it. It's too much extra weight, but he's driving it and he's telling it what to do. So he's got this commanding nature. Now a horse, of course, is a very powerful creature, very big. In this case, it would be obviously like a workhorse, so particularly huge. And it shows his strength, his command, and to some extent, this sort of affinity with the land, this affinity with nature and the natural world. Secondly, in line 7, the sod rolled over without breaking. So this is a key part of ploughing a field in the right way, that you need to churn up this dirt in a particular way. The sod rolled over without breaking is showing that there's an expertise here in the way that you achieve this to be done in the right way. And there is a delicate balance between literally digging up mud, which is not a very delicate sort of action, but the verb rolled, which gives this smoothness and is slightly more of a sort of precise and delicate verb, and without breaking. So we get the sense that this isn't just a sort of big, hulking, bulky guy who's going around, slamming stuff about. This is a person who is a master, and these are the kind of words that are used, expert and so on. And he's doing this with a level of precision. So that gives us another insight into the kinds of things that are inspiring the awe and the sympathy and the empathy within the son figure for his father. At line 10 to 11, his eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. Exactly is a really, really important adverb there, because it kind of has two meanings which sort of overlap. First of all, mapping the furrow exactly in the sense that he's doing this thing exactly right, but also in the related sense that you could have an exacting eye, which means that you would be seeing something in a very precise way and noticing the very, very, very sort of precise measurements. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground. His eye narrowed, that's not a friendly image. All of this is a sense of sort of respect and awe that the son has for the father, but it's not it's not always or all of it an example of a character who is very warm and sort of reciprocative. It's a person that actually is in the middle of doing his job, and the suggestion that the boy might actually be a nuisance is compounded by the idea that he's got this, he's got to be paying very close attention. So that's there as well. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground. It's a useful line to look at the mention of his eye, because over in Climbing My Grandfather we have some mention of the grandfather's eye as well, but it's a much warmer, more sort of friendly image that's being used there. Down on line 15, sometimes he rode me on his back. Well, there you go. There's a structural shift there, I think, from the first 3 stanzas through to the middle of the 4th stanza, where we actually suddenly see a kind of different side to this father, because we're in danger up to that point of thinking that this father is going to be quite a stern, severe, serious farmer figure who is concentrating on this one thing. And then you get this lovely image, he rode me on his back. A couple of interesting things in terms of the language here. One is the sometimes, okay, which, is nice, but that's not there by accident. We know, you don't need to say sometimes. We know that the father wouldn't have walked around permanently for his entire life with the boy on his back, but the sometimes just clarifies that maybe, by implication, sometimes he didn't play with me, sometimes he was too busy. So that kind of dynamic of the relationship is there. He rode me on his back, I think, is interesting, because we know what he means, and this is a dialectal syntactic construction, wherein the subjects and the objects are kind of reversed you don't need to get the specifics of this, but basically you know when you hear that, it should be, I rode on his back, he rode me on my back. That would be a way of saying that, and in certain parts of the country, in certain classes, make perfect sense. It does make perfect sense. I just think it's implying and kind of echoing the duality and the reciprocity of their relationship, in terms of, you know, having the ability to do the same thing to each other. So there are lots of details which are kind of encoded into the bigger image of the father ploughing the field. Over in Climbing My Grandfather, by comparison, we get a pretty neatly ordered list of the different features of the grandfather, starting at the bottom with the brogues, but each one is representative of a set of ideas about understanding the grandfather. The brogues, dusty and cracked. Well, brogues is this kind of shoe, I don't know if you know this, but it's a kind of shoe that has like dotted holes on the top, and they're quite fancy and they can be quite smart shoes these days, but they were originally invented to allow water to sort of seep out of your shoes if it got inside your footwear. So that, by implication, you can tell is sort of a real working class image. So it's a class thing, dusty and cracked. Okay, so there's a sort of implied metaphorical connotation here, once again, which is if your shoes are dusty and cracked, it means that you're well travelled, you've walked very far, you've used your feet a lot, and that in itself, isn't it, is a metaphor for having travelled to lots of places, and by implication to have had lots of different sort of experiences. Remember that this is an old man that we're talking about, and we're talking about the poet himself, who was born in 1958. So we can pretty sensibly take the grandfather character back to the very sort of beginning of the 20th century. And you know, with a bit of give or take, bit here or there, and figure out sort of how his life has panned out and how that then overlaps with 20th century history. The earth-stained hand, that was the brogues. The earth-stained hand is another detail here. Well, it won't have escaped you that the earth-stained hand is another metaphor for sort of a hard-working person, someone who is working class, the implication is, but someone who was, you know, it's another metaphor, got their hands dirty in life. They've done stuff. They haven't sat back and just been an observer, but they've got stuck in and they've worked hard. Think about the connections here between you know, Letters from Yorkshire and that question, which is at the heart of that poem. Is your life more real because you reap and sow, or you dig and sow, isn't it? And planting potatoes and breaking ice on the water butt. This whole notion that you know, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to have cracked and dusty shoes and to have weather-beaten hands, because it shows that there's some kind of value, some kind of virtue that you possess, because you have those characteristics of hard work. Very, very associated to that, the skin on his finger is smooth and thick. Well, if you're thick-skinned, that's another metaphor for, you know, being quite impervious to criticism, and by implication being sort of confident and knowing your own person and your own identity and your own personality. The next one is a scar, which of course is symbolic of the injuries you've sustained over the course of a lifetime. The reference to stitches here as well, the way he's been stitched back up. This is a person who has known battles, perhaps metaphorical, but also quite crucially, because this is a person who's going to have lived for decades in the first half of the 20th century, and therefore his lifespan will have overlapped with the First and the Second World War, but the implication, and this of course is a context point, is that we could be referring to real scars. So the metaphorical and the literal is combined there quite nicely. And it goes on, his still firm shoulder, I've seen this mentioned and it's very good. A shoulder is a part of the body which is symbolic of sort of shouldering weight and bearing heavy loads. And that's important here too. And it's all adding up to the same picture of someone who has metaphorically got their hands dirty in life, and they've lived a good life where they've taken some knocks, they've taken some bashes, they've sort of wrung as much possible as they could out of their life, even though this is an image of somebody who is now sedate, maybe sitting in a chair or something like that. It's not a very active picture. The scars and the dust and the cracked shoes are telling us everything we need to know. So there is some real kind of strong ways that you can look at those images and those language to talk about comparing the presentation of the two men and this sense of awe and respect that is felt by both of the poets here. I want to take this a little bit further and say something about this, which by now will have struck you. Some of you will have identified this already and have noticed that this is obvious. But we are into the realm of romanticization with a capital R, because both of these poems romanticize a kind of down-to-earth, earthy, working-class existence in a way which, as you all know, sort of took off from the Romantic period, so the late 1700s, the early 1800s, and the way that we were taught to think. We learned to think about, not working in the mud. That sounds really boring and horrible. But wait, what if actually that's really satisfying and that somehow makes your life more real? But they take influence in slightly different ways here. And this is, I think, a potentially very good and sophisticated AO3 point, because Andrew Waterhouse, Seamus Heaney, they're not romantic poets because they're not from the Romantic era. But as we've seen throughout the anthology, you can't really help being a 20th century poet without drawing on some of the sort of residue, the aftermath, the after echo of those Romantic poets. And in particular, I think with Seamus Heaney, you can be talking about the poet Robert Burns, who you may have heard of before, because you may well have heard of Burns Night and Haggis and whiskey and things like that. You may have mentioned Robert Burns when you studied the novel of Mice and Men, because the title of that novel, Of Mice and Men, is taken from a Robert Burns poem, and that's kind of relevant here. And another Romantic poet called John Clare. Neither of these two are in our big six Romantic poets, okay, but they are now considered definitely in the movement of Romanticism, writing in the 18th century and the early 19th century, a kind of poetry which, and they're linked by something Robert Burns and John Clare, is that they're both farmer poets. Robert Burns of a slightly sort of higher class, but John Clare in particular, literally a guy who worked ploughing fields, but also writing poems. Don't forget that not all of the Romantic poets were actually that working class. Of course, Lord Byron being a good example. Climbing My Grandfather then is also drawing on Romantic images, and that's a good connection, but the difference is that the Romantic image of a mountain is not to do with that pastoral romanticisation, not to do with those pastoral images of the like of Robert Burns and John Clare, but that sublime imagery that you might find more familiar in the poetry of Byron, or probably even a better example in terms of this anthology is Percy Shelley, who's talking about mountains and rivers and oceans and all this stuff. So you know the difference between the sublime imagery of big mountains inspiring awe within you, or muddy fields, which don't inspire awe within you, but inspire within you this weird sort of chocolate box warmth of wanting to go and sit in some, run down, ramshackle cottage in front of a roaring log fire and have a Sunday lunch or something, I don't know. But it's that kind of homely, very, very, very down-to-earth, mud under the fingernails kind of idea. And again, to mention, Letters from Yorkshire, to some extent the stuff that's in Eden Rock as well. That's all about, celebrating small level life that kind of is happening, that's not very glamorous, it's not very dramatic, but it's just, is your life more real? Okay, so those connections there with these two, I think, work really well again.